But thank you. Nice to see everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. I guess just some quick background. We are a US-based safety net charity, actually. So we support low and middle income patients and caregivers in the United States, hundreds of thousands of people to the tune of several hundred millions of dollars. So, Eric, happy to share with you about the role and the benefits of having funds available to support patients' medical care costs. Obviously, we in the U.S. We have a great healthcare system, but also know we're not exactly the envy of the world in a lot of ways, but especially when it comes to access and affordability. But one thing that we do have that's, I think, unique and a source of pride actually is ICER and their approach to patient engagement as well as evidence, and also their willingness to incorporate the patient voice and other aspects of what's important to patients in ways that may not be available to other HTA bodies, in part because they, as Kat said up front, they're not how they do their work is not dictated by anything in the regulatory framework or the legislative framework. So it does give them the space to be innovative and to be creative and to push the envelope. They don't have to, but they do. And I really appreciate that. And I'm not just saying that just by standing on the sidelines. We and many other groups here in the United States have been invited to and have participated closely with ICER as they've been on their journey of engaging patients and involving patients in the ways that Kat alluded to. And our journey with them started as early, I went back and looked at least 2016, when they were developing their own patient engagement guide. And really thanks to the work of Eleanor Perfetto, who many of you know, really was leading and helping facilitate that work and getting a lot of different patient groups involved. And I think Eric made the point, it's really important to build trust and credibility in this space of what I would also not just think about patient engagement, but patient-centered evidence. And I think those are both two sides of the same coin of patient-centered value. It's the patient engagement piece and the patient-centered evidence piece. And so, that process, and it's easier said than done. The patient engagement part, I think, is still difficult, but the easier part of it, the patient-centered evidence part, is the more challenging part. And that's where I'm going to end here in just a couple of minutes as we go through this quickly. But I think what ended up happening for us is ICER actually invited us as an organization to be on all their voting panels as a patient advocacy organization. So we have a representative that sits on, they have three different voting panels that are divided up into regions. And so we've had a front row seat going back to 2020, actually being on voting panels and watching each deliberation, including obviously the clinical effectiveness, all the different elements that Kat walked through. So I won't repeat them. But then there's also a lot of feedback from those voting panels, and there's meetings at the end of the year where we sit down together and really think about the process. And it's not just patient advocacy groups or patient advocates that are on the panel, although there are, beyond just us, there are patients on the panels and also that participate in the review process, as Kat outlined. But that's really provided an opportunity to think more deeply and really interrogate and amend the process of the deliberation. And so I think that's been a nice give and take with ICER and the leadership there and the folks that do the work to think about how can we broaden patient engagement, but also really start to incorporate these things that matter to patients that may or may not be in the data set. And that's the real rub, is what's in the data set at the end of the day. I do think when we're talking about patient-centered value, it's really important I already said patient engagement, patient-centered evidence kind of are the different sides of the same coin. But I also think it speaks a lot to who is involved. So the diversity and representation of the engagement, but also importantly, the evidence that's generated, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, really needs to represent a broad, a range of different types of patients. And I would argue the socioeconomic variability is probably the most important thing to get right from the beginning. And here in the United, obviously people don't think of the U.S. as a low and not even close, right? The opposite of a low and middle income country, but we do have low and middle income patients and caregivers, and that's true everywhere. And so I think that's the important, we want to include those countries in deliberations and also think about how, their HTA process is being set up. But also I think even in countries that have fewer low and middle income patients relative to other countries, that involvement of low and middle income patients and caregivers is really important everywhere and anywhere. So that's step number one. I think then what is involved? And I already alluded to it. It's really important to have that patient engagement, both in the HTA process throughout anything. Obviously for patient groups, it's really, this is all about being patient centered from beginning to end. But particularly in the evidence and the data generation, you have to have that representation. You have to have the data that speaks to what matters to patients. And that's the last point is which data are we talking about? You've seen it alluded to, Eric alluded to it, Kat alluded to it. It's not just data about the safety and efficacy. And it's not an or conversation. It's an and conversation. So you obviously need the clinical safety and efficacy data as a starting point. You need the quality of life data. But ultimately, and it was said in different ways, we just call it the necessities of life. What are those things about the treatment or the standard of care as a comparator, or that really differentiates, the experience of the patient as it relates to really fundamental things? Uh, you know, Time off work or the ability to be productive at work, transportation burden, caregiver burden, food on the table. The list goes on and on about things that are important to patients. And I think if you move away, when you think about the necessities of life and you think about the different journeys of low socioeconomic patients or low and middle income patients and caregivers, there's a fairly common theme across countries and across diseases of how different technologies may affect, either make better or make worse, in some ways, the lived experience of patients as it relates to the necessities of life. And make no doubt about it, those are a lot of the things that create access and affordability barriers if a therapy is ultimately approved and is available to the population in whatever healthcare setting that they're receiving their care in. So I think what this has led us to, after being heavily involved with ICER and then expanding internationally into working with groups like the Synergist and FT3 and PFND, and also ISPOR now for many years as well, being part of their patient councils, um, is really the key missing piece is the data piece, I would argue. So, even with ICER, who has really been, I think, at the forefront of trying to expand what is considered as part of the deliberations in terms of value to patients and meeting unmet needs, it does really often come down to more of a qualitative, and I would say even somewhat anecdotal conversation about what's important to patients and what may be missing. And I think Eric had a great example of how to take that, some of the things that might be missing and translate it into something more meaningful from a data perspective or from an awareness perspective. But that's the challenge, I think, is how do we, and it really has to start with the clinical, in my opinion, in the clinical trial data set. Because if it's not in the clinical trial data set, and that goes back to the original statements about, well, who is the data from in the clinical trial and which data are we talking about? And so if that data about the necessities of life and the lived experience of life and the unmet needs of patients, or how the needs of patients might be met better or differently, um, versus comparator or standard of care in a clinical trial, without that data that is often used in the first rounds of HTA analysis, the HTA bodies can only do so much to include, obviously engaging patients in their deliberations and process is one thing, but really using evidence and thinking differently about how they conduct their cost effectiveness review or the methodologies they use to do that. And I know those are constrained as well in some places by regulation or law, but without that innovation and the science of patient-centered evidence coming from the clinical trials and really expanding that data set to include these things that really matter to patients, those unmet needs, those different endpoints that speak to, obviously some things that are quality of life related, but also the important things in life that really drive whether or not you can afford care, like being able to stay at work or continue working. So I think that's the challenge, and that's where we've really started focusing our efforts is moving, I guess, more upstream in the process and trying to really engage those stakeholders that influence the data set, which in this case, I think is the clinical trial data set, whether it's, whether it's industry sponsored or investigator initiated, but also then, how are those data being treated and used in methodologies so that ultimately you're feeding then into the HTA environment new data and new data sets that can be used differently by groups like ICER and others to really think not just how do we involve patients in the deliberation and really have robust discussions about unmet needs or contextual considerations, as I think we used to call it now, as benefits beyond health. But how do we really have the data that so that we can have additional analyses so we can compete on a quantitative and qualitative plane at a level of rigor that is similar to the quality data and the safety and efficacy data